The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard of the Ramirez Ranch as Virginia Robinson clutched the crumpled newspaper advertisement in her trembling hands. The ink had smeared from her sweaty palms during the 3-mile walk from town, but the words remained clear enough to fuel the desperate hope burning in her chest. Cattle tender wanted, room and board provided. Apply at dawn. She had arrived before dawn, standing in the growing light like a scarecrow in her patched dress and worn boots, watching the ranch house for signs of life. The place sprawled before her like something from a dream, all weathered wood and endless pastures stretching toward the horizon. Cattle dotted the landscape like dark stones scattered by a giant's hand, and the sight of them made her heart race with possibility. Virginia had tended animals before, back when her parents were alive, back when she had a home and a future that extended beyond the next meal. Now at 19, she possessed nothing but the clothes on her back and a stubborn refusal to surrender to the fate that had claimed so many other orphaned girls in the territory. She would not end up in the brothels of Denver or married to some brutal man who saw her only as free labor. She would make her own way, even if it meant sleeping in barns and eating scraps. The front door of the ranch house opened with a creak that carried across the yard like a gunshot. Virginia straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, preparing to meet whatever judgment awaited her. A man emerged from the shadows of the porch, and her breath caught in her throat. Charles Ramirez moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life working with powerful, unpredictable animals. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the morning light and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen both kindness and cruelty, and something in his expression made Virginia's prepared speech die on her lips. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her threadbare dress and the way she held herself with desperate dignity. When he spoke, his voice carried the slight accent of his Mexican heritage, warm and rich, like good coffee. "You are here about the position." It was not a question, and Virginia nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had practiced her speech 100 times during the walk from town, but now the words seemed inadequate and foolish. "I can work," she managed finally. "I know cattle. I grew up on a ranch before." She let the sentence trail off, unwilling to speak of the fever that had taken her parents and left her with nothing but memories and the skills they had taught her. Charles stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on the packed earth. He moved closer, but not close enough to make her feel trapped, and Virginia found herself grateful for his consideration. Too many men had no such courtesy. "The work is hard," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "The cattle are stubborn, the weather is harsh, and the pay is small. Why would a young woman want such a life?" Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Virginia lifted her chin higher, meeting his gaze with all the courage she could muster. "Because it is an honest life, and I would rather face honest hardship than dishonest comfort." Something shifted in Charles's expression, a flicker of what might have been approval or recognition. He nodded slowly as if her answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Can you handle a rope?" "Yes." "Can you work alone for days at a time without losing your nerve?" Virginia hesitated only a moment. "Yes." Charles studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or deception. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he turned toward the barn and gestured for her to follow. "The cattle need to be moved to the north pasture today. It is a 2-day job for one person, maybe 3 if the weather turns. There is a line shack up there where you can sleep, but you will be alone with nothing but the wind and the coyotes for company. Are you certain you want this?" Virginia followed him across the yard, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was more than she had dared hope for, a chance to prove herself worthy of something better than charity or pity. "I am certain." The barn was dim and sweet-smelling, filled with the comfortable sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the rustle of hay. Charles led her to a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. "This is Sage," he said, running his hand along the horse's neck. "She knows the cattle and the land better than most people. If you listen to her, she will keep you safe." Virginia approached the mare slowly, extending her hand for the animal to smell. Sage nuzzled her palm with velvet lips, and Virginia felt a spark of connection that gave her courage. The cattle are scattered across the south pasture, Charles continued, pulling a saddle from a nearby rack. You need to gather them and drive them north to the summer grazing. It is not complicated work, but it requires patience and skill. One mistake could scatter the herd or get you trampled. He saddled Sage with efficient movements, his hands sure and gentle on the leather. Virginia watched carefully, noting the way he checked each strap and buckle, the way he spoke softly to the horse throughout the process. There are wolves in the high country, he said without looking at her, and men who are worse than wolves. If you see riders approaching, you hide. If you cannot hide, you run. Do you understand? Virginia nodded, though a chill ran down her spine. She had heard stories of the dangers that lurked in the remote corners of the territory, but she had hoped they were exaggerated. Charles handed her the reins and stepped back. Show me you can handle her. Virginia mounted Sage with practiced ease, settling into the saddle as if she belonged there. The mare responded to her touch with immediate trust, and Virginia felt a surge of confidence that she hoped showed on her face. Good, Charles said, and the single word of approval warmed her more than it should have. There is food in the saddlebags and blankets in the line shack. The work begins now. He opened the barn doors and morning sunlight flooded in, bright and full of promise. Virginia guided Sage toward the opening, but Charles's voice stopped her. Virginia, she turned in the saddle, surprised that he knew her name. She had not given it to him. The advertisement in the paper, he explained, reading her confusion. You signed your name to the bottom. A small thing, but it told me something about you. What did it tell you? Charles smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. That you are not afraid to claim what is yours. Virginia rode toward the south pasture with those words echoing in her mind. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, and Sage moved beneath her with the steady rhythm of an animal that knew its purpose. For the first time in months, Virginia felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The cattle were indeed scattered across the broad expanse of grassland, dark shapes moving slowly through the morning mist. Virginia counted nearly 200 head, a substantial herd that would require careful handling. She had worked with cattle before, but never alone and never with so much responsibility resting on her shoulders. She began at the eastern edge of the pasture, using Sage's training and her own instincts to gather the stragglers. The work was methodical and demanding, requiring constant attention to the mood and movement of the herd. Cattle were creatures of habit and hierarchy, and Virginia had to establish herself as the leader without frightening them into a stampede. The sun climbed higher as she worked, and sweat began to dampen her dress despite the cool air. Her muscles ached from the unfamiliar strain of long hours in the saddle, but she pushed through the discomfort with grim determination. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to prove that she could earn her place in the world through honest work. By midday, she had gathered most of the herd into a loose group and begun the slow process of driving them north. The cattle moved reluctantly, stopping frequently to graze or investigate interesting smells, and Virginia found herself constantly circling the edges of the group to keep them moving in the right direction. It was during one of these circuits that she first noticed the riders. They appeared as distant specks on the horizon, 3 men on horseback moving parallel to her course. At first, Virginia told herself they were simply travelers passing through, but as the afternoon wore on, the riders maintained their distance without ever disappearing from view. Charles's warning echoed in her memory, and Virginia felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She was alone in the vastness of the prairie, with no one to call for help and nowhere to hide. The nearest cover was a stand of cottonwoods along a creek bed, still miles away, and she could not abandon the cattle to seek shelter. She tried to focus on her work, guiding the herd steadily northward while keeping one eye on the distant riders. Perhaps they would lose interest and move on, or perhaps they were simply ranch hands from a neighboring spread going about their own business. But as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the riders began to close the distance. Virginia's hands tightened on the reins as she watched them approach. 3 men, as she had suspected, mounted on good horses and moving with purpose. Even from a distance, she could see that they were well armed and comfortable in the saddle. She considered her options with growing desperation. She could try to outrun them, but Sage was tired from the day's work, and the cattle would scatter without guidance. She could stand her ground and hope they meant no harm, but something in their deliberate approach suggested otherwise. The lead rider was close enough now that she could make out his features. He was a large man with a thick beard and clothes that had seen better days. His companions flanked him on either side, and all three wore the hard expressions of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Well, well," the bearded man called out as they drew near. "What have we here? A little girl playing cowboy?" Virginia straightened in her saddle, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I am working. You are welcome to pass through, but please do not disturb the cattle." The man laughed, a harsh sound that made Sage's ears flick nervously. "Disturb the cattle? Girl, we are not here for the cattle." One of his companions, a thin man with pale eyes and a cruel mouth, spurred his horse closer. "Pretty little thing, is not she, Eugene? Bet she gets lonely out here all by herself." Eugene Wright, Virginia realized with a chill. She had heard that name whispered in the saloons and general stores of the territory, a man who took what he wanted and left ruin in his wake. "Please," Virginia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have done nothing to you. Let me pass." Eugene's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "Oh, but you have done something, little wall girl. You have wandered into our territory without permission. That requires a toll." The third man, silent until now, guided his horse to block Virginia's escape route to the north. She was surrounded, trapped between three predators and a herd of cattle that offered no protection. "What kind of toll?" Virginia asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Eugene's eyes traveled over her body with undisguised hunger, the kind that pretty girls pay when they venture into places they do not belong. Virginia's mind raced, searching for any possibility of escape. The cottonwoods were still too far away, and even if she could reach them, three mounted men could easily run her down. Her only weapons were a small knife in her boot and whatever courage she could summon. "I work for Charles Ramirez," she said, hoping the name might carry some weight. "He is expecting me to return with these cattle." Eugene's expression darkened at the mention of Charles's name. "Ramirez? That half-breed thinks he owns this whole valley. Well, he does not own you, does he, little girl?" The malice in his voice told Virginia that invoking Charles's name had been a mistake. Whatever history existed between these men and her employer, it would not work in her favor. "No," she said quietly, "he does not own me. No one does." "We will see about that," Eugene said, dismounting from his horse with predatory grace. "Boys, secure the area. We do not want any interruptions." Virginia's hand moved instinctively toward the knife in her boot, but she forced herself to remain still. 3 against 1 were impossible odds, but panic would only make her situation worse. She needed to think, to find some advantage in the desperate circumstances. The cattle, sensing the tension in the air, began to shift and mill about nervously. A few of the younger bulls lifted their heads and snorted, their eyes rolling white with anxiety. Virginia realized that the animals might be her only allies in the confrontation to come. Eugene approached Sage with the confident stride of a man who had done this before. "Get down from there, girl. No point in making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Virginia said, her voice gaining strength from somewhere deep inside her. "I will not." Eugene's face twisted with anger. "You will do as you are told, or we will make you regret it." He reached for Sage's bridle, but Virginia was ready for him. She dug her heels into the mare's sides and pulled hard on the reins, causing Sage to rear and strike out with her front hooves. Eugene stumbled backward, cursing, and Virginia seized the moment to drive Sage directly into the center of the cattle herd. The sudden intrusion of a running horse sent the cattle into a frenzy of motion. They scattered in all directions, lowing and bellowing in confusion, and Virginia found herself in the middle of a churning sea of horns and hooves. She heard Eugene Armain shouting orders to his men, but the thundering of cattle hooves drowned out his words. A young bull charged past her, so close that she could feel the heat of its body, and Virginia realized that she was in almost as much danger from the panicked animals as she was from the men. But the chaos also provided cover, and Virginia used it to her advantage. She guided Sage through the milling cattle, staying low in the saddle to avoid being seen, and gradually worked her way toward the edge of the herd. A gunshot cracked through the air, and Virginia felt her blood turn to ice. One of Eugene's men was firing into the air, trying to turn the cattle and expose her hiding place. The sound only made the animals more frantic, and Virginia realized that her desperate gambit was about to collapse. She broke free of the herd just as Eugene spotted her. He was back on his horse now, his face twisted with rage, and he spurred his mount toward her with murderous intent. "You little witch!" he screamed. "You will pay for that!" Virginia leaned low over Sage's neck and urged the mare to greater speed. The cottonwoods were still distant, but they offered the only hope of shelter in the vast expanse of prairie. Behind her, she could hear the thunder of pursuing hooves and Eugene's continued curses. Sage ran with the heart of a true cow pony, her hooves eating up the ground with desperate efficiency. But she was tired from the long day's work, and Virginia could feel her beginning to labor. The pursuing horses were fresh and gaining ground with every stride. A second gunshot rang out, and Virginia heard the whistle of a bullet passing close to her head. Eugene was shooting to wound now, trying to bring down her horse and end the chase. Virginia pressed herself even lower in the saddle and whispered desperate encouragements to Sage. The cottonwoods loomed ahead, their green canopy promising shelter and concealment. Virginia could see the glint of water through the trees and knew that the creek would slow her pursuers if she could reach it. Just a few more yards, and she would have a fighting chance. But Sage stumbled, her front hoof catching in a prairie dog hole, and Virginia felt the mare's rhythm falter. They were so close to safety, but the pursuing horses were closing fast, and Virginia knew that their desperate flight was about to end. She pulled Sage to a stop at the edge of the cottonwood grove and slid from the saddle, her legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. The trees offered some concealment, but not enough to hide from determined searchers. She had perhaps minutes before Eugene and his men reached her. Virginia drew the small knife from her boot and tested its weight in her hand. It was a pitiful weapon against 3 armed men. But it was all she had. She would not go down without a fight. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Virginia pressed herself against the trunk of a large cottonwood, trying to become invisible. Through the trees, she could see Eugene and his men spreading out to surround the grove, their faces grim with purpose. "Come out, little girl," Eugene called. "You have caused us enough trouble. Time to pay the price." Virginia closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. She thought of her parents, of the lessons they had taught her about courage and dignity, and found strength in their memory. She would face whatever came with her head held high. But as Eugene's voice grew closer, as the sound of boots on fallen leaves announced his approach, Virginia realized that courage might not be enough. She was alone, outnumbered, and trapped with nowhere left to run. The knife felt small and inadequate in her trembling hand as she prepared to make her final stand. A new sound cut through the afternoon air, the rhythmic thunder of hooves approaching at speed. Virginia's heart leaped with desperate hope, but she forced herself to remain hidden. It could be more of Eugene's men, or simply travelers who would not involve themselves in her plight. But the voice that rang out across the prairie was one she recognized, deep and commanding and edged with steel. "Right, get away from those trees." Charles Ramirez sat his black stallion like an avenging angel, his rifle trained on Eugene's position. Even from a distance, Virginia could see the cold fury in his posture, the way he held himself with the coiled tension of a man prepared for violence. Eugene emerged from the cottonwoods with his hands raised, but his expression remained defiant. "Well, if it is not the half-breed himself, come to rescue your little pet." "She works for me," Charles said, his voice carrying easily across the open ground. "That makes her under my protection." Eugene's 2 companions had spread out to flank Charles, but they seemed uncertain in the face of his obvious competence with the rifle. Virginia could see them calculating odds and distances, weighing their chances against a man who showed no fear. "Your protection?" Eugene laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Since when do you protect anything but your own interests, Ramirez?" Charles urged his horse closer, the rifle never wavering from its target. "Since now. Tell your men to stand down, right? This does not have to end in blood." "Doesn't it?" Eugene's hand drifted toward his gun. "You think you can just ride in here and take what we have claimed? The girl is ours by right of conquest." "The girl," Charles said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "belongs to herself, and she is under my protection. That is the end of the discussion. Virginia watched the confrontation unfold with her heart in her throat. Charles was outnumbered 3-1, and while he was clearly skilled, the odds were heavily against him. She gripped her small knife tighter and prepared to emerge from hiding if the situation turned violent. But something in Charles's bearing, some quality of absolute certainty and controlled lethality, seemed to give Eugene's men pause. They were predators, but they were also survivors. And they recognized a more dangerous predator when they saw one. Eugene, however, was driven by pride and rage beyond rational calculation. His hand moved toward his gun with sudden speed, and Virginia saw Charles's finger tighten on the rifle trigger. The shot rang out across the prairie like thunder, and Eugene spun around, clutching his shoulder. His gun fell from nerveless fingers as he dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt. "The next one goes through your heart," Charles said calmly, working the rifle's action to chamber another round. "Your choice, right?" Eugene's companions looked at their wounded leader and made their decision. They holstered their weapons and stepped back, their hands held wide to show they meant no further threat. "This is not over, Ramirez," Eugene gasped, struggling to his feet with his good arm. "You cannot protect her forever." "I can protect her long enough," Charles replied. "Now get on your horses and ride out. If I see any of you on my land again, I will not aim for your shoulder." The three men mounted their horses with obvious reluctance, Eugene swaying in his saddle from blood loss and pain. They rode away toward the east, Eugene turning back once to glare at Charles with naked hatred. Virginia emerged from the cottonwoods on trembling legs, still clutching her knife. Charles dismounted and approached her slowly, his rifle held loose in his hands, his eyes scanning her for signs of injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle now that the danger had passed. Virginia shook her head, not trusting her voice. The aftermath of terror and relief left her feeling hollow and strange, as if she were watching events from outside her own body. Charles studied her face with concern. "They did not touch you?" "No," Virginia managed. "You arrived in time." Charles nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I should not have sent you out alone. I knew Wright and his men were in the area, but I thought they would not venture so close to the ranch." "How did you know to come?" Virginia asked. "The cattle," Charles said, gesturing toward the scattered herd that was slowly beginning to regroup in the distance. "I saw them running from the south pasture and knew something was wrong. Sage would never let them scatter unless there was trouble." Virginia looked at the faithful mare who stood nearby with her head hanging from exhaustion. The horse had saved her life with her speed and courage, and Virginia felt a surge of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Now we gather the cattle and finish the job. But things have changed, Virginia. Wright will not forget this, and he will not forgive it. As long as you work for me, you will be in danger." Virginia lifted her chin with familiar determination. "I am not afraid." "You should be," Charles said seriously. "Eugene Wright is a dangerous man with dangerous friends. He will not let this insult pass." "Then what are you saying, that I should leave?" Charles looked at her for a long moment, and Virginia saw something shift in his expression. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I am saying that if you stay, you will not work alone anymore. The cattle can wait. Your safety cannot." Virginia felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words. It was not pity or charity she heard in his voice, but something deeper and more complex, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch in her throat. "I do not need protection," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "Everyone needs protection sometimes," Charles replied, "even those who are strong enough to protect themselves." He moved closer, and Virginia caught the scent of leather and sage that seemed to cling to him. His eyes were dark and serious, and she found herself unable to look away. "The question is," he said softly, "are you willing to let me provide it?" Virginia stared at him, her mind reeling with the implications of his words. This was more than an offer of employment, more than simple concern for her welfare. This was something that could change everything, if she had the courage to accept it. But before she could answer, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the prairie once again. Charles spun toward the sound, his rifle coming up instinctively, and Virginia felt her heart sink with the certainty that Eugene Wright had returned with the reinforcements. The riders crested a low hill to the east, silhouetted against the setting sun, and Virginia counted at least 6 mounted figures, too many for even Charles to handle, no matter how skilled he might be. "Run," Charles said quietly, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "Take Sage and head for the ranch. Do not look back." "I will not leave you," Virginia said, moving to stand beside him. "You will if you want to live," Charles replied. "This is not your fight." But as the riders drew closer, Virginia realized with growing dread that it was very much her fight. Eugene Wright had indeed returned, and he had brought enough men to ensure that this time there would be no escape. The 6 riders approached with deliberate menace, their horses' hooves drumming a funeral march against the hard-packed earth. Virginia's breath came in short gasps as she recognized not just Eugene Wright's bloodied form among them, but also the distinctive silhouette of Jacob Edwards, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him like a shadow across the territory. Edwards sat his horse with the easy confidence of a predator who had never known defeat, his cold eyes fixed on Charles with calculating interest. "Ramirez," Edwards called out as the group drew within speaking distance. "Heard you had some trouble with my associate here." Charles kept his rifle trained on the approaching riders, but Virginia could see the tension in his shoulders. 6 against 1 were impossible odds, even for a man of his evident skill. "Wright trespassed on my land and threatened my employee. I defended what was mine." Edwards laughed, a sound like winter wind through dead leaves. "Your employee? That little scrap of nothing?" His gaze shifted to Virginia, and she felt ice form in her veins. "Seems like an awful lot of trouble for hired help." "The amount of trouble I take for my people is my business," Charles replied evenly, "just as the amount of trouble you will face for continuing this conversation is yours." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with 6 guns against 1 and nowhere to run. Virginia's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. The cottonwoods offered no real shelter against determined men, and Sage was too exhausted from the day's chase to outrun fresh horses. But as the silence lengthened, Virginia noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope. Edwards's men were not the hardened killers she had expected. 2 of them kept glancing nervously at Charles's rifle, and a third had his hand resting on his gun, but seemed reluctant to draw it. They were hired muscle, not committed fighters, and their uncertainty might be the edge Charles needed. "Tell you what, Ramirez," Edwards said, his voice taking on a deceptively reasonable tone. "We will make this simple. The girl comes with us, and you ride away. No one else has to get hurt today." "No," Charles said without hesitation. "Find another solution." Edwards's expression hardened. "There is no other solution. Right here has a claim on the girl, and I am here to see that claim enforced." Virginia stepped forward, her small knife still clutched in her trembling hand. "I am not property to be claimed by anyone." "Pretty words," Edwards sneered, "but out here might makes right, and we have more might than you do." That was when the first shot rang out from the ridge behind them. The bullet took one of Edwards' men clean out of his saddle, and suddenly the afternoon erupted into chaos. More shots followed from concealed positions among the rocks, and Virginia realized with amazement that Charles had not come alone after all. "Get down," Charles shouted, grabbing Virginia's arm and pulling her behind the shelter of a fallen log. His rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, and another of Edwards' men cried out in pain. Through the gunsmoke and confusion, Virginia could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions on the ridge. Charles's reinforcements had the high ground and the advantage of surprise, and Edwards's men were caught in the open with nowhere to take cover. "Who are they?" Virginia gasped, pressing herself against the log as bullets whined overhead. "Ranch hands," Charles replied, working the action of his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Good men who know the value of loyalty." The battle was brief but fierce. Edwards' hired guns, faced with determined resistance from concealed positions, quickly lost their appetite for the fight. 2 were down, 1 was wounded, and the others were looking for any excuse to retreat. Edwards himself seemed stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune. He had expected to find Charles alone and vulnerable, not prepared for a fight with hidden allies. His horse danced nervously beneath him as bullets kicked up dirt around its hooves. "This is not over," Edward shouted over the gunfire. "You cannot hide behind your men forever, Ramirez." "I do not hide behind anyone," Charles called back. "But I am not fool enough to face 6 men alone when I have friends willing to stand with me." Edward spurred his horse toward the wounded Eugene Wright, who was swaying in his saddle from blood loss and shock. "We will settle this another time," he snarled, then wheeled his mount and led the retreat eastward across the prairie. The gunfire ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the smell of powder smoke and the ringing in Virginia's ears. Charles rose from behind the log and signaled to his men on the ridge, and 3 figures began making their way down the rocky slope. Virginia recognized them as they approached. Nathan Parker, the ranch foreman, was a grizzled man in his 50s whose weathered face spoke of decades spent under the western sun. Edward Hernandez, barely older than Virginia herself, moved with the quick grace of youth tempered by hard experience. The third man was a stranger to her, tall and lean, with the careful eyes of someone who had seen trouble and survived it. "Everyone all right down here?" Nathan called out as he reached them. "We are fine," Charles replied. "Thanks to your timing." Nathan spat into the dust and adjusted his hat. "Saw the dust cloud from the ridge and figured you might need some help. Good thing we brought extra ammunition." Edward Hernandez approached Virginia with concern evident in his dark eyes. "You are not hurt, señorita?" Virginia shook her head, still too shaken to trust her voice. The young man's kindness was a sharp contrast to the violence that had just erupted around them, and she found herself grateful for the reminder that not all men were predators. The stranger introduced himself as Tom Mitchell, a drifter who had signed on with the ranch only days before. "Heard shooting and came running," he said with a slight smile. "Seemed like the neighborly thing to do." Charles studied the man with interest. "You handle yourself well in a fight." Tom shrugged. "A man picks up skills when he needs them." As the group began to relax, Virginia found herself studying the faces around her. These men had risked their lives for her, a woman they barely knew, simply because Charles had asked it of them. The loyalty they showed him spoke volumes about the kind of man he was, and Virginia felt something warm and complicated stirring in her chest. "We should get back to the ranch," Nathan said, scanning the horizon for signs of Edward's return. "Those men might come back with more friends." Charles nodded, but his attention was focused on Virginia. "Can you ride?" Virginia looked at Sage, who stood nearby with her head hanging from exhaustion. The faithful mare had already given everything she had in the earlier chase, and Virginia could not ask her for more. "Sage needs rest," she said. "But I can walk if necessary." "No need for that," Edward said, leading his own horse forward. "You can ride with me. My horse is strong enough to carry 2. Virginia hesitated, glancing at Charles for guidance. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to identify, but he nodded his agreement. "Edward will see you safely back," he said. "I need to gather what cattle we can find before dark." The ride back to the ranch passed in relative silence, with Virginia seated behind Edward on his sturdy bay gelding. The young man was respectful and careful, ensuring her comfort without being presumptuous, and Virginia found herself appreciating his quiet consideration. Behind them, Charles and the others worked to round up the scattered cattle, their voices carrying across the prairie as they called to the animals and to each other. The familiar sounds of ranch work seemed almost surreal after the violence of the afternoon, as if the world was trying to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Virginia could feel it in the way Edward's shoulders tensed whenever he looked back toward the horizon, in the way Nathan kept his rifle across his saddle, even as they approached the safety of the ranch buildings. Eugene Wright and Jacob Edwards had made their intentions clear, and the threat they represented would not disappear with the setting sun. As they crested the final hill before the ranch house, Virginia caught sight of a figure standing on the front porch. Even from a distance, she could tell it was a woman, and her heart sank with the realization that Charles's life was more complicated than she had imagined. The woman was tall and elegant, with dark hair pinned up in a style that spoke of education and refinement. Her dress was well-made and fashionable, a sharp contrast to Virginia's patched and dusty clothing. She stood with the poise of someone accustomed to command, and when she saw the approaching riders, she moved down the porch steps with graceful urgency. That is Susan Evans, Edward said quietly, noting Virginia's attention. She owns the spread to the west of us. Good woman, but he let the sentence trail off, leaving Virginia to wonder what he had been about to say. Susan reached them as Edward helped Virginia down from the horse. Up close, she was even more striking, with intelligent, green eyes and the kind of natural beauty that needed no enhancement. She was perhaps 30 years old, Virginia guessed, with the confidence that came from wealth and position. Edward, Susan said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. I heard shooting from the direction of the south pasture. Is everyone all right? Yes, ma'am, Edward replied. Just some trouble with trespassers. Charles handled it. Susan's gaze shifted to Virginia, taking in her disheveled appearance and the small knife still clutched in her hand. And you are? Virginia Robinson, Virginia managed, suddenly acutely aware of how she must look. I work for Mr. Ramirez. Something flickered in Susan's expression, too quick to interpret. I see. Well, you look as though you have had quite an ordeal. Perhaps you should come inside and clean up. It was phrased as a suggestion, but Virginia heard the subtle command in the words. Susan Evans was clearly a woman accustomed to having her wishes obeyed. And Virginia found herself following the older woman toward the ranch house, despite her desire to wait for Charles's return. The interior of the house was more refined than Virginia had expected, with furniture that spoke of comfort rather than mere utility. Susan led her to a small washroom and provided clean water and towels, her manner efficient but not unkind. You are very young to be working cattle alone, Susan observed as Virginia cleaned the dust and sweat from her face. I am old enough, Virginia replied, hearing the defensive note in her own voice. Susan smiled, but there was something calculating in her expression. Of course you are. I simply meant that it is dangerous work, especially for a woman. Perhaps you would be better suited to other employment. Virginia's hands stilled on the towel. What kind of employment? I am always in need of household help, Susan said smoothly. The work would be easier, safer, and the pay would be better than whatever Charles is offering you. The offer was generous, probably more generous than Virginia deserved, but something in Susan's tone made her wary. Why would you make such an offer to a stranger? Susan's smile became more genuine. Because I recognize quality when I see it. You have spirit, Virginia Robinson, and intelligence. Those are rare qualities in this territory. Before Virginia could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced Charles's return. Susan's attention immediately shifted toward the window, and Virginia saw her expression soften in a way that made her stomach clench with unexpected jealousy. Charles is back, Susan said, moving toward the front door with obvious eagerness. Virginia followed more slowly, her mind churning with questions and doubts. The easy camaraderie she had felt with Charles seemed suddenly fragile in the face of Susan Evans's obvious claim on his attention. Charles dismounted from his black stallion as they emerged onto the porch, his clothes dusty from the work of gathering cattle. He looked tired but satisfied, and when he saw Susan, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. Susan, he said, removing his hat, I did not expect to see you today. I heard the shooting, Susan replied, moving down the steps to meet him. I was worried about you. Charles's expression grew serious. Jacob Edwards and Eugene Wright. They were after Virginia. Susan's gaze flicked briefly to Virginia before returning to Charles. All the more reason why she should not be working alone on the range. It is too dangerous. I agree, Charles said, and Virginia felt her heart sink. Which is why things are going to change around here. Virginia braced herself for dismissal for the polite but firm suggestion that she seek employment elsewhere. Instead, Charles turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. From now on, you work close to the ranch house. No more long rides to distant pastures, no more nights alone in line shacks. The work is just as important, but it will keep you within reach of help if the trouble comes. Virginia felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. She would still have work, but the independence she had craved would be curtailed by the very real threat that Edwards and Wright represented. That is sensible, Susan agreed, though I still think my offer of household employment would be safer still. Charles looked between the two women, and Virginia saw something shift in his expression. What offer? I have offered Virginia a position in my household, Susan explained. Better pay, safer work, and she would be well cared for. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Virginia's face. And what do you think of this offer? Virginia felt the weight of both their expectations, the pressure to choose between safety and the unknown possibilities that working for Charles might bring. She thought of the way he had risked himself to save her, of the loyalty his men showed him, of the moment when he had asked if she would let him protect her. I appreciate Mrs. Evans's kindness, she said carefully, but I gave my word to work for you, Mr. Ramirez. I do not break my word lightly. Susan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but Charles smiled with what looked like genuine relief. Then it is settled. You will continue to work here, but under new arrangements for your safety. As if summoned by his words, Nathan Parker approached from the direction of the barn. His weathered face was grim with concern, and he carried himself with the urgency of a man bearing bad news. Charles, he said, nodding respectfully to Susan before continuing, we need to talk. Found some things while we were gathering the cattle that you need to see. Charles's expression grew alert. What kind of things? Nathan glanced meaningfully at Virginia and Susan, the kind best discussed in private. Charles nodded and turned to the women. If you will excuse me, ladies, Susan, will you be staying for dinner? I think not, Susan replied, her manner suddenly cool. I have matters to attend to at my own ranch. But Charles, please consider what we discussed last week. The offer remains open. She moved toward her horse, which Virginia now noticed was a beautiful Palomino mare of obvious quality. As she mounted with practiced grace, she looked down at Virginia with an expression that was not quite hostile, but certainly not friendly. Think about my offer as well, Miss Robinson. It may be the wisest choice you ever make. With that, she rode away toward the west, leaving Virginia alone with Charles and Nathan. The silence that followed her departure was heavy with unspoken tensions and possibilities. What did she mean about an offer you discussed? Virginia asked, though she was not certain she wanted to know the answer. Charles watched Susan's retreating figure for a moment before answering. Susan has been suggesting that I sell the ranch and move east. She believes there are better opportunities for someone with my education and background. Nathan spat into the dust. Better opportunities for someone who wants to turn his back on everything he has built. Charles shot his foreman a warning look, but Nathan continued undeterred. Begging your pardon, Charles, but that woman has been filling your head with fancy notions ever since her husband died and left her that spread. She does not understand what this place means to you. Virginia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. You are considering leaving? Charles looked at her for a long moment, and she saw an uncertainty in his dark eyes. I am considering many things, but first let us hear what Nathan has found. It may change our options considerably. Nathan led them toward the barn, his expression growing grimmer with each step. Inside, he had arranged several items on a wooden crate that served as a makeshift table. Virginia gasped when she saw what he had collected. There were surveyor's stakes, marked with official symbols and numbers. A leather portfolio containing what looked like legal documents. Most ominously, there was a small wooden sign that read, Property of Mountain Valley Development Company. No trespassing. Found these scattered around the south pasture, Nathan explained. Looks like someone has been doing some unofficial surveying of your land. Charles. Charles picked up one of the documents and scanned its contents, his face darkening with each line he read. This is a preliminary survey report. They are mapping the water sources and mineral deposits. Mineral deposits? Virginia asked. Copper mostly, but there are indications of silver as well, Charles replied grimly. Enough to make the land very valuable to the right buyers. Nathan nodded. And Mountain Valley Development Company has been buying up mineral rights all through this territory. They make offers that seem generous until you realize they are planning to strip mine everything and leave the land worthless for ranching. Virginia felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. That is why Edwards was so confident. He was not just after me. He was after your land. It makes sense, Charles agreed. Driving me off through violence and intimidation, then swoop in with a low offer for distressed property. It is an old game, but effective. Nathan picked up another document from the pile. This one is interesting. It is a letter of intent to purchase dated 3 weeks ago. Someone has already made an offer on your ranch. Charles took the letter and read it quickly, his expression growing thunderous. $50,000 for the entire spread. Oh, about half what it is actually worth. Who made the offer? Virginia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Charles looked up from the document, his eyes hard as flint. Mountain Valley Development Company, represented by their local agent, one Jacob Edwards. The revelation hit Virginia like a physical blow. Edwards had not been acting out of simple malice or loyalty to Eugene Wright. He had been conducting business, using violence and intimidation as tools to acquire valuable property at a fraction of its worth. "So what do we do?" Nathan asked. Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents as if they might reveal some hidden solution. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. "We prepare for war," he said simply. "Edwards will not stop with today's failure. He will escalate until he gets what he wants, or we stop him permanently." Virginia felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean?" "It means more men, more guns, and more violence," Charles replied. "It means turning this ranch into an armed camp and living under constant threat. It means asking good men to risk their lives for my fight." Nathan straightened his shoulders. "It is our fight too, Charles. This is our home as much as yours." "Is it?" Charles asked quietly. "Or am I being selfish, asking you all to risk everything for a piece of land that might not be worth the blood it will cost to keep?" Virginia heard the doubt in his voice and understood suddenly why Susan Evans's offer to leave might seem attractive. The weight of responsibility for other people's lives was crushing, and the prospect of walking away from it all must be tempting. "What would happen to the men if you sold?" she asked. Charles shrugged. "Nathan could find work anywhere. He is the best foreman in the territory. Edward and the others are young and skilled. They would land on their feet." "And what would happen to me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Charles looked at her with an expression that was part longing and part regret. "You would be safe," he said finally. "Susan's offer is genuine. She would treat you well." "That is not what I asked." Charles met her gaze, and Virginia saw the war being fought behind his dark eyes. "I do not know," he admitted. "I do not know what would happen to any of us." Nathan cleared his throat diplomatically. "Maybe we should focus on what we know for certain. Edwards will be back, probably with more men and a better plan. We need to be ready for him." Charles nodded, seeming to shake off his moment of uncertainty. "You are right. How many men can we count on?" "For fighting, maybe 8 or 10, counting the seasonal hands. Not enough to hold off a determined assault, but enough to make them pay dearly for any victory." "What about allies? Other ranchers who might have an interest in stopping Edwards?" Nathan considered this. "Most of the smaller spreads are too scared to get involved, but there are a few who might stand with us if they understood what was at stake." "Such as?" "Jim Crawford, he has the spread to the north. Good man, fair fighter. He has been having his own troubles with claimed jumpers lately. Might be willing to make common cause." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Anyone else?" "There is talk that the territorial governor is finally going to send federal marshals to deal with the land grabbing. But talk is cheap, and Edwards will not wait for the law to catch up with him." Virginia listened to the discussion with growing unease. The men were talking about preparing for a siege, about calling in favors and making alliances, about turning the ranch into a fortress. But what if there was another way? "What if we could prove that Edwards is working illegally?" she asked. "Those documents, the surveying without permission, the attempts at intimidation. Surely that is enough to bring in the law." Nathan shook his head. "The nearest federal marshal is in Denver, 3 days' ride away. By the time we could get word to him and he could organize a response, Edwards would have finished whatever he is planning." "Then we send word tonight," Virginia insisted. "One of us rides hard for Denver, while the others prepare the defenses. At least then we would have legal recourse if we survive long enough to use it." Charles looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "It is a good plan, but it requires someone willing to make that ride alone through dangerous country. Edwards will have men watching the trails." "I will go," Virginia said without hesitation. "Absolutely not," Charles replied immediately. "You are the reason Edwards is escalating in the first place. Sending you away from the ranch would be exactly what he wants. Then send Edward, Virginia suggested. He is young and fast, and Edwards does not know him well enough to anticipate his movements. Nathan nodded slowly. It could work. Edward knows the back trails, and his horse is strong enough for the journey. Charles considered this for a moment, weighing risks and possibilities. It would leave us short-handed for the defense. But it might make the defense unnecessary, Virginia pointed out. If we can get federal law involved, Edwards will have to back down or face consequences he cannot buy his way out of. Before Charles could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the yard once again. All three of them tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. But the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. "Charles, you in there?" It was Jim Crawford, the neighboring rancher Nathan had mentioned. Charles relaxed slightly and called back. "In the barn, Jim. Come on in." Crawford entered leading his horse, a big man with graying hair and the kind of solid presence that inspired confidence. His face was grim with purpose, and he wasted no time on pleasantries. "Heard there was trouble over here today." "Edwards and his boys?" "Among others," Charles confirmed. "How did you hear about it?" "One of my hands saw the dust cloud and heard the shooting. Figured it might be connected to the problems I have been having." Nathan leaned forward with interest. "What kind of problems?" Crawford's expression darkened. "Survey stakes on my land, just like the ones you have got there. Offers to buy at prices that would not feed my cattle for a year. And yesterday, someone took a shot at my youngest boy while he was checking the north fence line." Charles and Nathan exchanged meaningful looks. "Edwards is moving against multiple targets," Charles said, "trying to acquire as much land as possible before anyone can organize resistance." "That is what I figured," Crawford agreed. "Which is why I came to talk to you about standing together. Edwards thinks he can pick us off one at a time, but if we present a united front, he might think twice." "What are you proposing?" Charles asked. Crawford pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I have been talking to some of the other ranchers. We want to form a mutual defense pact. Anyone who gets attacked, the others come running. Pool our resources and manpower until this threat is dealt with." Charles took the paper and scanned its contents. "How many men are we talking about?" "Maybe 30 or 40, all told. Not professional fighters, but good men who know how to handle themselves." Virginia felt a surge of hope. 30 or 40 armed men would be more than enough to discourage Edwards from any direct assault. But even as the thought formed, she realized that Edwards was too smart to be deterred by superior numbers alone. "He will not attack directly if he knows we are organized," she said aloud. "He will find another way." Charles looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Virginia thought back to the events of the day, to Edwards's cold confidence and calculated approach. He is a businessman first and a killer second. If violence becomes too expensive or too risky, he will find a different strategy. Such as? Legal challenges, political pressure, economic warfare. There are many ways to drive someone off their land without firing a shot. Crawford nodded grimly. "The girl is right. Edwards has money and connections. If we make it too costly for him to use force, he will just buy judges and politicians instead." Charles folded the mutual defense agreement and handed it back to Crawford. "I will sign it, but we need to do more than just prepare for a fight. We need to take the fight to him." "What did you have in mind?" Charles looked at the surveying documents scattered on the crate, his expression hardening with resolve. "We prove that he is operating outside the law and make sure the right people know about it. Force him to back down or face federal prosecution." Crawford smiled for the first time since entering the barn. "Now you are talking sense. What do you need from me?" Before Charles could answer, the barn door burst open and Edward Hernandez stumbled inside, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Charles," he gasped, "thank God you are still here. I rode as fast as I could." "Edward, what is wrong?" The young man struggled to catch his breath, his words coming in short bursts. "Riders, heading this way. Maybe 20 of them, armed for war." Charles felt his blood turn to ice. "How far out?" "Maybe an hour. I saw them from the ridge above Miller's Creek. They are not trying to hide their approach." Crawford swore under his breath. "Edwards is not waiting for us to organize. He is striking now while he still has the advantage. Charles looked around the barn at the faces of the people who depended on him. Virginia, pale but determined. Nathan, weathered and loyal. Edward, young and frightened but still standing ready to fight. Crawford, offering alliance in the face of mutual threat. 20 armed men against the handful they could muster. The odds were impossible, the outcome inevitable, unless they could find another way. Virginia, Charles said quietly, that ride to Denver we discussed, how quickly could you be ready? Virginia's eyes widened with understanding. Give me 10 minutes. Edward, saddle the fastest horse we have. Nathan, gather every weapon and round of ammunition on the ranch. Jim, can your men be here within the hour? Crawford shook his head. Not all of them, maybe 10 or 12. Charles nodded grimly. It will have to be enough. We make our stand here, and we make Edwards pay dearly for every inch of ground. As the group dispersed to their tasks, Charles caught Virginia's arm. If you get through, if you reach Denver, tell the federal marshal everything. Show him the documents. Make him understand what is happening here. Virginia looked into his eyes, seeing the fear he was trying so hard to hide. What if I do not make it through? Charles was quiet for a moment, his hand still resting on her arm. Then at least you will have tried. That is all any of us can do. Virginia felt tears threatening, but she forced them back. There would be time for tears later, if she survived to shed them. Charles, I know, he said softly. I know. And in that moment, with the sound of approaching danger growing louder and the weight of impossible odds pressing down on them, Virginia finally understood what Charles had been trying to tell her. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the outcome. Some stands had to be made, even when victory seemed impossible. She nodded once, then turned and ran toward the house to gather what few possessions she could carry. Behind her, the men continued their desperate preparations for a battle that would determine not just the fate of the ranch, but the future of everyone who called it home. The sun was setting in the west, painting the sky the color of blood, and Virginia could not shake the feeling that she was seeing it for the last time. Virginia's hands shook as she secured the leather satchel containing the surveying documents to her saddle. The horse Edward had chosen was a young chestnut gelding named Thunder, built for speed rather than endurance, but capable of covering ground quickly when it mattered most. The animal sensed the urgency in the air and danced nervously beneath her as she made final adjustments to the stirrups. Through the barn door, she could see Charles directing the defensive preparations with calm efficiency that belied the desperate nature of their situation. Nathan had positioned men at strategic points around the ranch buildings, while Edward distributed ammunition with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every bullet might mean the difference between life and death. The sound of approaching hooves grew louder with each passing minute, a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. 20 armed men, Edward had said, riding hard toward the ranch with violent intent. Even with Crawford's reinforcements, they would be outnumbered 2-1, facing professional killers rather than honest ranchers defending their homes. Charles appeared at Thunder's side, his face grave in the fading light. The back trail through Devil's Canyon is your best chance. It will add hours to your journey, but Edwards will not expect you to take that route. Virginia nodded, though the thought of navigating the treacherous canyon trail in darkness filled her with dread. Devil's Canyon had earned its name through the broken bones of countless travelers who had misjudged its narrow ledges, bivouacs, and hidden pitfalls. What if I do not make it through the canyon? Charles placed his hand on her knee, the warmth of his touch steadying her frayed nerves. You will make it. You have the heart of a fighter, Virginia Robinson, and fighters find a way. The distant sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the main trail, followed by shouts and the thunder of galloping horses. Crawford's advanced scouts had made contact with Edward's force, buying precious minutes with their courage and their lives. Go, Charles said urgently. Go now, while there is still time. Virginia leaned down from the saddle, her face close to his in the gathering darkness. Charles, if something happens to me, if I do not return, I want you to know that these past days have been the happiest of my life. You gave me hope when I had none, purpose when I felt worthless, and something I thought I would never find. What is that? A home, she whispered. You gave me a home. Charles's hand tightened on her knee, his eyes reflecting the pain of a man watching something precious slip away. "This is not goodbye, Virginia. You will return, and when you do, we will finish the conversation we started." More gunfire echoed across the prairie, closer now, and Virginia knew that her window of escape was closing rapidly. She straightened in the saddle and gathered Thunder's reins, feeling the horse's eagerness to run. "Hold them as long as you can," she said. "I will bring help." Charles stepped back and slapped Thunder's rump, sending horse and rider racing into the night. Virginia leaned low over the gelding's neck as they thundered across the ranch yard and toward the dark mouth of Devil's Canyon, leaving behind the only place that had ever felt like home and the man who had made it possible. The trail into the canyon was barely visible in the starlight, a narrow ribbon of packed earth that wound between towering walls of stone. Thunder picked his way carefully along the treacherous path, his hooves ringing against rock as Virginia guided him through the maze of obstacles that had claimed so many travelers before them. Behind her, the sound of battle grew fainter with distance, but never disappeared entirely. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls like ghostly reminders of the desperate fight being waged for the ranch's survival, and Virginia found herself praying to whatever gods might be listening that Charles and his men could hold out until help arrived. The canyon trails seemed to stretch endlessly through the darkness, each turn revealing new hazards and challenges. Loose rocks shifted beneath Thunder's hooves, threatening to send them both tumbling into the abyss below. Narrow ledges forced them to press against the canyon wall as they navigated passages barely wide enough for horse and rider. But Thunder proved worthy of his name, moving with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat despite his breeding for speed. The young gelding seemed to understand the importance of their mission, picking his way through the hazards with careful determination that matched Virginia's own desperate resolve. Hours passed in the strange twilight world of the canyon, where starlight filtered down through the narrow gap between stone walls, and every sound echoed with supernatural clarity. Virginia's body ached from the constant tension of navigating the dangerous trail, but she pushed through the discomfort with single-minded focus on the task ahead. Dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon when they finally emerged from Devil's Canyon onto the broad plateau that stretched toward Denver. Thunder was lathered with sweat and breathing hard from the night's exertions, but his stride remained strong and his spirit unbroken. Virginia allowed herself a moment to look back toward the ranch, but the distance and intervening hills made it impossible to see any sign of the battle that might still be raging there. She could only hope that Charles and his men had survived the night, and that her desperate ride would not prove to be in vain. The trail to Denver stretched before them like a promise, and Virginia urged Thunder into a ground-covering lope that would carry them toward help and hope. The morning sun warmed her back as they rode, and for the first time since the crisis began, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually succeed. The federal marshal's office in Denver occupied the ground floor of a sturdy brick building that spoke of government authority and permanence. Virginia dismounted from Thunder's heaving back and tied him to the hitching post with hands that shook from exhaustion and nervous anticipation. The gelding had carried her faithfully through the night and into the morning, covering ground that should have taken 2 days in less than 18 hours. The marshal himself was a tall, lean man in his 50s named William Hayes, with graying hair and the kind of steady eyes that had seen enough trouble to recognize it when it walked through his door. He listened to Virginia's breathless account with growing interest, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of the complex forces at work in the territory of Vermont. Mountain Valley Development Company, he mused, examining the surveying documents Virginia had carried from the ranch. "We have been watching them for months. They have been using similar tactics throughout Colorado and Wyoming, always staying just within the bounds of the law. But this time they have gone too far," Virginia insisted. "The violence, the intimidation, the illegal surveying of private property. Surely that is enough to act." Marshal Hayes nodded slowly. "It would be if we could prove it in court. But Edwards is careful to keep his hands clean. The men who do his dirty work are expendable, and they know better than to implicate their employer if they are caught." Virginia felt her heart sink with the realization that even federal law might not be enough to stop Edwards' campaign of terror. "Then what can you do?" "I can investigate," Hayes replied. "I can gather evidence, interview witnesses, and build a case that will stand up in court. But that takes time, And from what you have told me, time is something your friends do not have. The marshal stood and moved to a large map of the territory that covered most of one wall. He studied it for a moment, tracing the locations of various ranches and settlements with his finger. There is another option, he said finally. More direct, but also more dangerous. What kind of option? Hayes turned back to face her, his expression grave. If Edwards is operating outside the law, then he has forfeited the protection of that law. A federal marshal has the authority to deputize civilians in emergency situations, to form a posse to deal with immediate threats to public safety. Virginia felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. You would do that? I would consider it, under the right circumstances. But it would require proof that Edwards is actively engaged in criminal activity, not just planning it, and it would put everyone involved at considerable risk. Before Virginia could respond, the office door burst open and a young man in deputy's clothing stumbled inside, his face pale with exhaustion and his clothes dusty from hard travel. "Marshal," he gasped, "thank God you are here. I just rode in from the Ramirez Ranch. There has been a battle." Virginia's blood turned to ice. What kind of battle? The deputy looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting to find a civilian in the marshal's office. "Who is this?" "Miss Robinson works for Charles Ramirez," Hayes explained. "She brought me information about illegal activities in the area. Now tell us what happened." The deputy nodded and struggled to catch his breath. "Edwards and his men attacked the ranch just after midnight. Maybe 20 riders, all armed for war. Ramirez and his people fought them off, but it was a near thing." "Casualties?" Virginia whispered. "3 of Edwards' men dead, several wounded. On Ramirez's side, 2 men hurt, but none killed. They held the ranch house and main buildings, but Edwards burned the barn and scattered the cattle." Virginia closed her eyes with relief that Charles had survived, but the news of the attack provided exactly the evidence Marshal Hayes needed to act. "That settles it," Hayes said grimly. "Edwards has crossed the line from intimidation to open warfare. I am authorizing the formation of a federal posse to restore order and arrest those responsible." He moved to his desk and began pulling papers from various drawers, his movements quick and efficient. "Deputy Morrison, send word to all the ranchers in the area. Tell them that any man willing to serve as a temporary deputy should report here within 2 hours. We ride for the Ramirez Ranch this afternoon." Virginia felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. Help was coming, but would it arrive in time to prevent further violence? And what would she find when she returned to the ranch that had become her home? "Marshal," she said quietly, "I want to ride with the posse." Hayes looked up from his paperwork with surprise. "Miss Robinson, this is going to be dangerous work. These men are killers, and they will not surrender without a fight." "Then you will need every gun you can get," Virginia replied. "I know the ranch better than any of your men, and I have as much stake in the outcome as anyone." The marshal studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "Very well. But you follow orders without question, and you stay back when the shooting starts." "Understood." "Understood." As Hayes and his deputy worked to organize the posse, Virginia found herself thinking about Charles and the conversation they had left unfinished. He had asked if she would let him protect her, and she had been too frightened to give him a clear answer. But now, riding back toward danger with a badge pinned to her shirt and a federal marshal's authority behind her, she realized that protection was not something one person gave to another. It was something they built together, through trust and courage, and the willingness to stand side by side against whatever threatened their shared future. The posse that assembled in front of the marshal's office 2 hours later was an impressive sight. 23 men, all armed and mounted on good horses, wearing the temporary badges that gave them federal authority. They were ranchers and cowboys, shopkeepers and drifters, united by a common determination to restore law and order to their territory. Marshal Hayes addressed them from horseback, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "Gentlemen, we are riding to arrest Jacob Edwards and his associates for assault, arson, and conspiracy to commit fraud. These are dangerous men who will not hesitate to kill anyone who stands in their way. But they have forgotten something important about this territory." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled faces. They have forgotten that out here decent people stand together. They have forgotten that justice may be slow, but it is certain. And they have forgotten that no amount of money or influence can protect a man from the consequences of his actions. The posse rode out of Denver in formation, with Marshal Hayes at the head and Virginia riding beside him. Behind them came 21 determined men, each carrying the weight of federal law in the hope of restoring peace to their troubled land. The journey back to the ranch took most of the afternoon, with the posse maintaining a steady pace that covered ground quickly without exhausting their horses. Virginia found herself scanning the horizon constantly, looking for signs of smoke or other evidence of continued violence. As they crested the final hill before the ranch, Virginia gasped at the sight that greeted them. The barn was indeed gone, reduced to a pile of smoldering timbers and ash. The cattle were scattered across the landscape, and several of the outbuildings showed signs of damage from the battle. But the ranch house still stood, and Virginia could see figures moving around it with purposeful activity. Charles and his men had not only survived the attack, but were already beginning the work of rebuilding and recovery. Marshal Hayes raised his hand to halt the posse, then pulled out a pair of field glasses to survey the scene below. I count maybe 15 men around the ranch buildings. All appear to be engaged in legitimate work. No sign of Edwards or his people. They probably retreated after the attack, Virginia said. Edwards is not the type to stay and fight when the odds turn against him. Hayes nodded and signaled for the posse to advance. They rode down the hill in formation, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun, and Virginia felt her heart racing with anticipation of seeing Charles again. He emerged from the ranch house as they approached, his face lighting up with amazement and relief when he saw Virginia riding beside the federal marshal. Despite the exhaustion and strain of the past 24 hours, he moved toward them with the fluid grace that had first caught her attention. Marshal Hayes, Charles said, extending his hand, I did not expect to see federal law in these parts so quickly. Miss Robinson can be very persuasive, Hayes replied, dismounting and accepting Charles's handshake. She rode through Devil's Canyon in the dark to bring us word of your situation. Charles looked at Virginia with an expression that combined admiration, gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. She has more courage than most men I know. Courage and good sense, Hayes agreed. Now suppose you tell me exactly what happened here and where we might find Jacob Edwards. Charles led the marshal and Virginia toward the ranch house, pointing out the damage from the previous night's attack as they walked. The barn was a total loss, but the other buildings had suffered only minor damage. More importantly, none of his men had been killed, though 2 were nursing wounds that would keep them laid up for several days. Edwards attacked just after midnight, Charles explained. 20 men, maybe more, all armed with rifles and plenty of ammunition. They tried to burn us out, but we had prepared defensive positions and enough firepower to make them pay for every yard of ground. Marshal Hayes examined the bullet holes in the ranch house walls and the scorch marks where firebombs had been thrown. This was a coordinated military-style assault. Edwards has escalated far beyond simple intimidation. That was his mistake, Nathan Parker said, approaching from the direction of the bunkhouse. His weathered face bore new lines of exhaustion, but his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a man who had faced death and emerged victorious. He thought he could frighten us into surrendering. Instead, he just made us angry. Virginia looked around at the faces of the men who had defended the ranch, seeing the quiet pride and determination that came from standing together against impossible odds. These were not professional soldiers, but they had fought like veterans, driven by loyalty to Charles and love for the land they called home. Where is Edwards now? Hayes asked. Charles pointed toward the eastern hills. He retreated in that direction just before dawn, lost 3 men and had several more wounded. I doubt he will try another direct assault anytime soon. But he will try something, Virginia said with certainty. Edwards does not give up easily, and he has too much invested in this land to walk away. Hayes nodded grimly. Which is why we need to find him and his remaining men before they can regroup. Do you have any idea where they might have gone? Nathan spat into the dust. There is an old mining camp about 10 miles east of here. Abandoned for years, but the buildings are still standing. Perfect place for men who want to stay hidden while they plan their next move. Can you guide us there? I can, Charles said, but it will mean leaving the ranch undefended if Edwards doubles back. Hayes considered this for a moment. I will leave half the posse here to guard your property. The rest of us will go after Edwards. If we can capture him and his key lieutenants, the rest of his organization will collapse. Virginia felt a chill of apprehension. What if it is a trap? Edwards might be expecting pursuit. Then we will be ready for him, Hayes replied. But we cannot let him escape to terrorize other ranchers. This ends today, one way or another. As the marshal organized his men for the pursuit, Virginia found herself alone with Charles for the first time since her desperate ride to Denver. He looked at her with an expression that combined relief, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart race. You came back, he said simply. I told you I would. Charles stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her face with gentle reverence. When I saw you riding with the marshal, I thought I might be dreaming. After everything that happened, after the battle and the uncertainty, I was afraid I might never see you again. Virginia leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth and strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. I made you a promise, Charles Ramirez. I do not break my promises. What promise was that? To finish the conversation we started, she said softly. You asked me if I would let you protect me. I was too frightened then to give you the answer you deserved. Charles's eyes searched her face, looking for the answer he hoped to find. And now? Virginia took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of a life spent working with his hands and fighting for what he believed in. Now I understand that protection is not something one person gives to another. It is something two people build together, through trust and courage and the willingness to stand side by side against whatever comes. Charles smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. Is that your answer? Part of it, Virginia replied. The rest is this. I do not want your protection, Charles Ramirez. I want your partnership. I want to build something together that neither of us could create alone. I want to tend your cattle and your land and your heart if you will let me. Before Charles could respond, Marshal Hayes called out from across the yard. Ramirez, we are ready to move out. Are you coming? Charles looked toward the marshal, then back at Virginia, his face torn between duty and desire. I should go with them. Edwards is dangerous and they will need every gun they can get. Then I am going too, Virginia said firmly. Absolutely not. It is too dangerous. Virginia smiled and touched the federal badge pinned to her shirt. I am a sworn deputy now, Charles. I have as much right and responsibility to see this through as anyone. Charles stared at the badge with amazement. Hayes made you a deputy? Temporary appointment, but it carries the full authority of federal law. And more importantly, it means I do not have to wait for someone else to protect me. I can protect myself and the people I care about. Charles was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with new understanding. When he spoke, his voice was filled with pride in something that might have been love. Then we go together, he said. Partners. Partners, Virginia agreed. They mounted their horses and joined the posse as it prepared to leave for the abandoned mining camp. Virginia rode Thunder, who had recovered from his night-long journey and seemed eager for action. Charles sat his black stallion with the easy confidence of a man who had found his purpose and his place in the world. The abandoned mining camp lay in a narrow valley between two ridges, its weathered buildings clustered around the entrance to a played-out silver mine. Hayes deployed his men carefully, surrounding the camp and cutting off all escape routes before moving in for the arrest. But as they drew closer, it became apparent that something was wrong. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No horses stood at the hitching posts. No signs of life stirred among the empty buildings. They are gone, Charles said grimly. Edwards was too smart to stay in an obvious hiding place. Hayes signaled for the posse to advance cautiously, weapons ready for any sign of ambush. But the camp proved to be genuinely abandoned. With only the cold ashes of old campfires and scattered debris to show that anyone had been there recently. Virginia dismounted and examined the ground around the main building, her eyes picking out details that the others had missed. They were here, she said, maybe 6 or 8 men with pack horses carrying the supplies, but they left hours ago, probably just after dawn. Which direction? Hayes asked. Virginia pointed toward a narrow trail that led up the southern ridge. That way, toward the territorial border. Charles nodded with understanding. Edwards is running for New Mexico. He knows that federal jurisdiction becomes more complicated once he crosses the border. Hayes swore under his breath. We can still catch them if we move fast. That trail is rough country, and they are traveling with wounded men. The posse remounted and set off in pursuit, following the trail up the steep ridge and into the high country beyond. The path was treacherous, winding through stands of pine and aspen that provided perfect cover for ambush. But Edwards seemed more interested in escape than in making a final stand. They followed the trail for hours, pushing their horses hard through terrain that grew increasingly difficult with altitude and distance. Virginia found herself impressed by Thunder's stamina and sure-footedness, the young gelding proving himself worthy of the trust Charles had placed in him. As the afternoon wore on, they began to find signs that they were closing the gap. Fresh horse droppings, still warm to the touch. Discarded equipment that suggested Edwards' men were lightening their loads for speed. Most encouraging of all, spots of blood on the rocks that indicated at least one of the wounded men was slowing the group's progress. The trail crested a high ridge just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and Virginia felt her heart leap as she caught sight of movement in the valley below. Edwards and his remaining men were there, perhaps 2 miles ahead, their horses moving slowly along the bottom of a narrow canyon. Hayes pulled out his field glasses and studied the distant figures. I count 7 men, maybe 8. They are moving slowly, probably because of the wounded. We can catch them if we push hard. Charles pointed toward a game trail that branched off from the main path. That trail leads down into the canyon about a mile ahead of them. We could get there first and set up an ambush. Good thinking, Hayes agreed. Half the men with me down the main trail, the other half with Ramirez on the game trail. We will catch them in a crossfire and force them to surrender. Virginia found herself assigned to Charles's group, and she followed him down the treacherous game trail with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was it, the final confrontation that would determine whether Edwards' reign of terror would continue or end in federal custody. The game trail was barely wide enough for a single horse, winding down the canyon wall through loose rock and stunted trees that offered minimal cover. Charles led the way with the confidence of a man who knew the country, his black stallion picking its way carefully through the hazards. They reached the canyon floor just as Edwards' group came into view around a bend in the trail. Virginia counted 8 men, all heavily armed and mounted on good horses despite their obvious fatigue. Edwards himself rode at the head of the column, his face grim with the knowledge that pursuit was close behind. Charles signaled for his men to take cover behind the scattered boulders that littered the canyon floor. Virginia found herself crouched behind a large rock with her rifle ready, her heart pounding with the anticipation of battle. Marshal Hayes and his group appeared on the ridge above, just as Edwards spotted the ambush. The outlaw leader shouted a warning to his men and spurred his horse toward the only escape route, a narrow side canyon that led deeper into the mountains. "Federal marshals," Hayes called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender." Edwards' response was a rifle shot that chipped rock near Hayes' position. Instantly, the canyon erupted in gunfire, and both sides opened up with everything they had. The battle was fierce but brief. Edwards' men, caught in a crossfire between Hayes' position on the ridge and Charles' ambush on the canyon floor, found themselves in an impossible situation. 2 went down in the first volley, and a third threw down his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. But Edwards himself was not finished. Realizing that capture meant the end of everything he had worked for, he made a desperate break for the side canyon, spurring his horse recklessly over the rocky ground. Virginia saw him coming and stepped out from behind her boulder, rifle raised. "Stop, federal deputy!" Edwards' response was to swing his pistol toward her, his face twisted with rage and desperation. But before he could fire, Charles appeared beside Virginia, his own rifle trained on the fleeing outlaw. "It is over, Edwards," Charles called out. "Your men are dead or captured. You have nowhere left to run." Edwards pulled his horse to a sliding stop, his pistol wavering between Virginia and Charles. For a moment, the canyon was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the scrape of hooves on stone. You think you have won, Edwards snarled. But this is bigger than me. Mountain Valley Development Company has resources you cannot imagine. They will send more men, better men, and they will not stop until they own every acre of this territory. Maybe, Charles replied calmly, but they will have to do it legally, under the scrutiny of federal law. The days of intimidation and violence are over. Edwards laughed bitterly. You naive fool. You think the law means anything out here? Money is the only law that matters, and I have more money behind me than you can comprehend. Had, Virginia corrected. Past tense. Because right now you are under arrest for assault, arson, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Your money cannot buy you out of a federal prison. Edwards's eyes focused on her with hatred so pure it was almost tangible. You little witch. None of this would have happened if you had just stayed where you belonged. Where I belonged. Virginia felt anger rising in her chest. Anger at Edwards and all the men like him who thought they could decide where women belonged. I belong wherever I choose to be, doing whatever work I choose to do, with whatever man I choose to stand beside. Pretty words, Edwards sneered. But words will not stop what is coming. Mountain Valley has plans for this entire territory, and one half-breed rancher and his pet deputy will not stand in the way. That was when Charles's patience finally ran out. He stepped forward, his rifle never wavering from Edwards' chest. You made one mistake, Edwards. You made this personal. Edwards saw something in Charles's eyes that made him realize how close he was to death. His pistol hand began to shake as he weighed his chances of surviving the next few seconds. You would not shoot an unarmed prisoner, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You are not unarmed, Charles replied, and you are not a prisoner yet. You still have a gun in your hand and murder in your heart. That makes you a threat that needs to be eliminated. Marshal Hayes appeared at the mouth of the side canyon, his rifle trained on Edwards from a different angle. Drop the weapon, Edwards. Last warning. Edwards looked around the canyon, seeing armed men in every direction and no hope of escape. His shoulders sagged with defeat, and the pistol fell from nerveless fingers to clatter on the rocky ground. Jacob Edwards, Hayes said formally, you are under arrest for violations of federal law. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Hayes and his men secured Edwards and the surviving members of his gang, Virginia found herself alone with Charles among the scattered boulders of the canyon floor. The immediate danger was over, but the larger questions about their future remained unanswered. It is finished, Charles said, but his voice carried no satisfaction, only exhaustion. This part of it, Virginia agreed, but Edwards was right about one thing. Mountain Valley Development Company will not give up easily. They will find other ways to get what they want. Charles nodded grimly. Legal ways, hopefully. Court battles instead of gun battles. I can live with that kind of fight. Virginia studied his face, seeing the lines of weariness and strain that the past few days had etched there. Can you really spend years fighting lawyers and politicians and corporate interests? Is the ranch worth that kind of struggle? Charles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. I used to think it was. The land, the cattle, the independence of building something with my own hands. It all seemed worth any price. And now, Charles looked at her directly, his dark eyes reflecting depths of feeling that took her breath away. Oh, now I realize that none of it means anything without someone to share it with. The ranch is just dirt and grass and buildings. What makes it valuable is the people who call it home. Virginia felt her heart racing with the implications of his words. What are you saying? I am saying that I would rather lose the ranch and keep you than keep the ranch and lose you. I am saying that you are more important to me than anything else in this world. Before Virginia could respond, Marshal Hayes approached with Edwards in custody. The outlaw leader's hands were bound behind his back, and his face bore the defeated expression of a man who had gambled everything and lost. We will be heading back to Denver in the morning, Hayes told them. Edwards and his surviving men will stand trial for their crimes, and I expect the sentences will be severe. The territorial governor has made it clear that this kind of violence will not be tolerated. What about Mountain Valley Development Company? Virginia asked. Hayes smiled grimly. That is where your evidence comes in. The surveying documents you brought me, combined with Edwards's testimony, should be enough to launch a full federal investigation. If they have been operating illegally in other territories, they will face charges that could shut them down permanently. Charles shook hands with the marshal. Thank you for everything, Marshal Hayes. We could not have done this without you. Thank Miss Robinson, Hayes replied. She is the one who made it all possible. That was some ride she made through Devil's Canyon. As the posse prepared to make camp for the night, Virginia and Charles found themselves walking along the canyon floor in the gathering darkness. Above them, stars began to appear in the clear mountain air, and the sound of their footsteps echoed softly off the canyon walls. You never gave me your answer, Charles said quietly. To what question? I told you that you were more important to me than the ranch. I was hoping you might tell me how you feel about me. Virginia stopped walking and turned to face him in the starlight. I feel like I have been searching for something my whole life without knowing what it was. I thought it was security, or independence, or simply a place where I belonged. But it was not any of those things. What was it? Virginia reached out and took his hands in hers, feeling the strength and gentleness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. It was you, Charles Ramirez. It was finding someone who saw me as I really am and loved me anyway. Someone who believed in my strength even when I did not believe in it myself. Charles pulled her closer, his arms encircling her with protective warmth. Does that mean you will stay? Will you help me rebuild the ranch and fight whatever battles come next? I will stay, Virginia whispered, but not as your employee and not as someone you need to protect. I will stay as your partner, your equal, your wife if you will have me. Charles's answer was a kiss that spoke of promises made and futures shared, of two people who had found in each other the completion they had never known they were seeking. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and smiling through tears they had not realized they were shedding. Virginia Robinson, Charles said softly, will you marry me? Yes, she replied without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you and tend your cattle and share your dreams and fight your battles and build a life with you that neither of us could create alone. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to promises made in love and sealed with hope. And in the distance, the sound of Marshal Hayes calling his men to order reminded them that the world beyond the canyon was waiting for their return. But for now, in this moment, there was only the two of them and the future they would build together. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the rebuilt barn, with half the territory in attendance and Marshal Hayes himself performing the ceremony. Virginia wore a dress that Susan Evans had insisted on providing, a gesture of reconciliation that spoke to the older woman's fundamental decency despite her earlier opposition to the match. Susan had withdrawn her offer for Charles to sell the ranch and move east, recognizing that his heart belonged to the land and the woman who had chosen to share it with him. She had even offered to help finance the rebuilding efforts, though Charles had politely declined, preferring to rebuild with his own resources and the labor of his loyal men. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with Nathan Parker serving as best man and Edward Hernandez giving Virginia away in the absence of her own family. The young cowboy had tears in his eyes as he placed her hand in Charles's, and his voice was thick with emotion when he wished them both happiness and long life together. Virginia's wedding dress was beautiful, but she had insisted on wearing her boots underneath, a practical choice that drew laughter from the assembled guests and a knowing smile from her new husband. She was still the same woman who had applied for work tending cattle, and marriage would not change her fundamental nature. After the ceremony, there was dancing and feasting that lasted well into the night. The rebuilt barn proved perfect for the celebration, with its high rafters and spacious floor providing room for everyone to join in the festivities. Virginia found herself swept from partner to partner as the men of the territory claimed their right to dance with the bride, but her eyes never left Charles for long. He stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her with an expression of wonder and contentment that made her heart sing. This was the man who had seen her potential when she saw only desperation, who had trusted her with responsibility when others would have offered only charity, who had loved her for her strength rather than despite it. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart for their own homes, Virginia and Charles found themselves alone in the ranch house that was now truly theirs. The furniture was simple but comfortable, the rooms clean and welcoming, and the sense of home that Virginia had felt from her first day was stronger than ever. "No regrets?" Charles asked as they stood together on the front porch, watching the last of their guests ride away into the star-filled night. "None," Virginia replied firmly. "This is where I belong, Charles. This is where I have always belonged." Charles pulled her close, his arms encircling her with the protective warmth that had become as familiar as breathing. "Even when the next crisis comes, because there will be other challenges, other threats to what we are building here." Virginia smiled and leaned into his embrace. "Especially then. We are stronger together than either of us could ever be alone. Whatever comes, we will face it as partners." The months that followed proved the truth of her words. Mountain Valley Development Company was indeed shut down by federal investigation, its assets seized and its executives imprisoned for fraud and conspiracy. But other threats emerged to take its place, as they always did in a territory where law was still fragile and justice often depended on the courage of individuals willing to stand up for what was right. Virginia proved herself again and again in the years that followed, not just as Charles's wife, but as a force in her own right. She became known throughout the territory as a woman who could handle cattle as well as any man, who could shoot straight when threatened, and who never backed down from a fight when the cause was just. She and Charles built their ranch into one of the most successful operations in Colorado, but more importantly, they built a partnership that became legendary among their neighbors. They worked side by side in all things, sharing decisions and responsibilities with the easy cooperation of two people who trusted each other completely. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, was born 2 years after their wedding. She was followed by two sons and another daughter, each raised to understand that strength came not from dominating others, but from standing together against whatever challenges life might bring. Virginia never forgot the lessons of those first desperate days when she had arrived at the ranch with nothing but determination and hope. She made sure that the ranch always had work for those who needed it, regardless of their background or circumstances, and she became known throughout the territory as someone who would give anyone a chance to prove themselves. The cattle business prospered under their joint management, but Virginia's greatest pride was in the home they had created together. It was a place where love and respect flourished, where children learned the value of hard work and honest dealing, where neighbors knew they could find help in times of trouble. Charles often said that the best decision he had ever made was placing that advertisement in the newspaper. But Virginia knew better. The best decision had been his willingness to see past her desperate circumstances to the person she could become with the right opportunity and support. Years later, when their hair had turned gray and their hands bore the scars of a lifetime spent working the land, Virginia would sometimes stand on the front porch of the ranch house and remember that first morning when she had arrived with nothing but hope and determination. The girl who had clutched that crumpled newspaper advertisement seemed like a stranger now, but Virginia could still feel her presence in quiet moments. That girl had been searching for work, for security, for a place where she belonged. What she had found was something infinitely more valuable, a partner who believed in her strength, a home built on mutual respect and love, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ranch still sprawled before her like something from a dream, all weathered wood and endless pastures stretching toward the horizon. Cattle still dotted the landscape like dark stones scattered by a giant's hand, and the sight of them still made her heart race with the satisfaction of work well done. But now there were other things to see as well. The children playing in the yard, the grandchildren learning to ride, the neighbors who stopped by for advice or simply to share the news of the day. The ranch had become more than just a business or even a home. It had become the center of a community built on the principles that she and Charles had established together. Virginia Robinson Ramirez had found her place in the world, not by accepting what others thought she deserved, but by demanding the opportunity to prove what she was capable of achieving. She had applied to tend cattle and ended up tending a heart, building a life, and creating a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. The morning sun still cast long shadows across the dusty yard, just as it had on that first day so many years ago. But now Virginia stood in those shadows not as a desperate girl seeking work, but as a woman who had found her purpose and claimed her rightful place in the world. She had kept her promise to Charles, and he had kept his promise to her. Together they had built something beautiful and lasting, something that proved that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, could transform any hardship into opportunity, could turn even the most desperate beginning into a story worth telling. The cattle were calling, as they always did, and there was work to be done. Virginia smiled and stepped down from the porch, ready to face another day of the life she had chosen and earned and built with her own two hands, in the heart of the man who had seen her true worth from the very beginning. Behind her, the ranch house stood solid and welcoming, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they stood together against the world. And ahead of her, the endless pastures stretched toward a horizon bright with possibility and hope. Virginia Robinson Ramirez had found her home at last.